All right, let's go. Number 10. In 1997, archaeologists conducting excavations beneath a 1st century CE building in the Israeli port city of Ashkelon made a discovery that, in the words of the researchers who published it, required careful consideration before going public. In a Roman-era sewer system beneath what had likely been a bathhouse, they found the skeletal remains of approximately 100 infants, newborns, most of them, with no grave goods, no markers, no indication of formal burial of any kind, simply deposited in a drainage channel and left. Here's the scale of what that find represents. The infant cemetery at Ashkelon, documented by archaeologist Patricia Smith at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, dates from roughly the 1st to the 6th century CE, the Roman and Byzantine periods. DNA analysis of some remains indicated a majority were male. The infants had died shortly after birth, and the manner of deposition, in a sewer, not a burial ground, indicates they were not considered deserving of formal funerary rites. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing beyond the immediate horror of the find. Roman and Byzantine legal structures placed newborns in a category that did not require their deaths to be treated as deaths in any meaningful sense. Exposure and abandonment of infants, documented extensively in Roman written sources, was a recognized legal social mechanism for managing unwanted births, overwhelmingly affecting female infants and those born with visible defects. The Ashkelon sewer wasn't an anomaly, it was a system. A building in a busy port city, operating continuously for 5 centuries, with a drainage channel that served as a disposal site for lives considered not worth keeping. What's left is a sewer, in a city that still exists, that for 500 years collected the most vulnerable members of its population in a drainage ditch, and was only noticed when the pipes were excavated by archaeologists who were, initially, looking for something else entirely. Number 9. In 1881, the German archaeologist Georg Ebers, the same scholar whose name is attached to the Ebers Papyrus, examined a collection of mummified remains from Deir el-Bahri in Egypt that included a specimen so unusual it had been kept separately from the main royal cache. The mummy, an adult male, had been wrapped in an unstained sheepskin, an unclean material by Egyptian ritual standards, normally used only for criminals or the dishonored. His hands and feet had been bound before death, and his face, frozen in the state it reached at the moment of death, was locked in an expression of open-mouthed agony. Here's the scale of what modern forensic examination revealed. The mummy, long known as Unknown Man E, was subjected to CT scanning and DNA analysis by Zahi Hawass and forensic specialist Sahar Salim in 2011. The analysis confirmed he was approximately 18 to 20 years old, had died from asphyxiation, strangled or smothered, and that his DNA showed him to be the son of Ramesses III, the powerful 20th dynasty pharaoh who ruled Egypt from approximately 1186 to 1155 BCE. But here's where the nightmare deepens. A papyrus discovered separately, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, documents what historians now call the Harem Conspiracy, a plot by secondary wives and their associates to assassinate Ramesses III. One named conspirator was a prince called Pentuer, believed to be the son of a lesser wife who stood to gain from the pharaoh's death. The conspiracy failed partially. Ramesses III may have survived long enough to issue verdicts, though he too may have died from a separate throat wound, confirmed by CT scan in 2012. Pentuer, according to the papyrus, was permitted to kill himself rather than be executed, a mercy of sorts, in recognition of his royal blood. What's left is a mummy who has been lying in a state of frozen, open-mouthed horror since roughly 1155 BCE, wearing the skin of a criminal, hands and feet still bound, his face recording the exact moment of his forced death. A young man whose conspiracy failed, whose name was erased from monuments, and who has been screaming, silently, in a museum case in Cairo for 3,000 years. Number 8. In 2017, archaeologists excavating near the site of the Templo Mayor in central Mexico City, directly beneath the streets of one of the most densely populated urban areas in the world, confirmed the physical existence of something that Spanish colonial chroniclers had described in such extreme terms that many historians had questioned whether they were exaggerating. The Huaytzompantli, a tower of skulls. Not a metaphor, not a symbolic construction, an actual, physical tower, constructed from the skulls of sacrificial victims, cemented together with lime mortar, built adjacent to the main ceremonial complex of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and described by Spanish soldiers who saw it standing in 1519 as stretching high enough to be visible from a considerable distance and containing thousands of heads. Here's the scale of what excavation confirmed. The archaeologists, led by Raul Barrera Rodriguez of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, found a circular base approximately 5 meters in diameter, containing the skulls of at least 676 individuals, cemented into a solid mass. And this was only a portion of the structure's base. Crucially, the demographic profile defied the traditional narrative of Aztec sacrifice, as primarily involving male warriors captured in battle. Among the confirmed skulls were a significant number of women and children. But here's where the story becomes genuinely chilling. The Tzompantli wasn't hidden. It stood in the open, at the center of a city of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 people, visible in daily life. A permanent display of the empire's relationship with death and divine obligation. The Spanish described their horror at encountering it. What they may not have grasped was that the population of Tenochtitlan passed it every day, in a city where the boundary between the living and the sacrificed was built into the architecture of the capital itself. What's left is a partial base, still being excavated beneath the streets of Mexico City, 7 meters below the pavement that commuters walk on every morning. Surrounded by urban infrastructure, slowly being uncovered, skull by skull, in one of the most populated cities on Earth. Number 7. In 2016, archaeologists excavating at the ancient cemetery of Phaleron Delta in Athens, Greece, announced the discovery of a mass burial site containing 80 human skeletons. And what distinguished this find immediately from any ordinary ancient cemetery was what was attached to the bodies. Every one of the 80 individuals had their wrists bound by iron shackles. They had been buried in a single mass grave in orderly rows, all facing the same direction, hands restrained, sometime in the late 7th or early 6th century BCE. Here's the scale of what this discovery represents. The site at Phaleron Delta dates to the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, a period that includes the Cylonian affair, in which a nobleman named Cylon attempted to seize power in Athens around 632 BCE and failed. His followers, who had taken sanctuary at a temple, were reportedly killed by the ruling archon Megacles, despite assurances of safety, a religious crime that haunted Athenian politics for generations. The bound skeletons at Phaleron may represent those executed followers, killed in a political purge at the very beginning of what would become the world's first democracy. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing in its implications. These were not anonymous victims. They were young men, in good health at the time of death, buried carefully and in order, suggesting that whoever killed them considered them worth the effort of organized burial, even if not worth the effort of releasing their chains first. Some researchers have noted that the orderly burial, despite the restraints, suggests these weren't massacre victims dumped in haste, but executed prisoners afforded a specific kind of formal, if brutal, disposal. What's left is 80 skeletons, still shackled, in a museum in Athens, the possible physical remains of the political violence that immediately preceded the invention of democracy, the executed bodies of men who died in a power struggle in a city that would, within a generation, become the foundational example of participatory government. Number 6. In the Italian town of Ercolano, on the western slope of Mount Vesuvius, in August of 79 CE, the pyroclastic surge that killed the residents of Herculaneum moved faster and at a higher temperature than anything in Pompeii. Archaeologists excavating the ancient shoreline of Herculaneum beginning in the 1980s found hundreds of individuals who had taken shelter in boat chambers along the beach, apparently waiting for rescue that never came. Here's the scale of what happened to them. The pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of volcanic gas and debris moving at up to 100 kilometers per hour, reached temperatures estimated at 500 degrees Celsius or higher. The deaths were instantaneous. But in 2020, researchers led by Pier Paolo Petrone at the University of Naples published forensic analysis of the skeletal remains from the boat chambers, revealing something no one had documented before in any volcanic event in the archaeological record. The victims' brains had vitrified. The extreme heat had vaporized the soft tissue of the brain, and then, as the temperature dropped in the immediate aftermath, the residue had solidified into what researchers described as a black, glassy material with the optical properties of volcanic glass. Brain tissue, converted into glass, within the skull of a person who had been alive minutes before, in a process so rapid that the skull itself remained largely intact. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. One individual, a young man found collapsed on a wooden bed in what is believed to have been a guard post, showed this vitrification process most completely, and analysis of the glassy material found biological molecules consistent with brain tissue, including proteins associated with the nervous system. What was extracted from his skull was not just glass. It was glass that still contained the molecular remnants of a human mind, preserved in the moment of its destruction. What's left is a glass fragment in a laboratory in Naples, chemically derived from the brain of a person who died on a beach in 79 CE while waiting for a boat that wasn't coming. The last physical evidence of a mind that has been glass for nearly 2,000 years. Number 5. In 1980, construction workers building an apartment complex in the Talpiot neighborhood of East Jerusalem, approximately 2.5 kilometers south of the Old City, accidentally broke through the roof of an ancient rock-cut tomb. Israeli archaeologist Joseph Gath was called to the scene and, over the following weeks, carefully documented and removed the tomb's contents. 10 limestone ossuaries, or bone boxes, used in Jewish burial practice during the Second Temple period, roughly 50 BCE to 70 CE. Here's the scale of what those inscriptions showed. 6 of the 10 ossuaries bore inscriptions. The names were Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus, son of Joseph; Maria; Yose, a diminutive of Joseph, noted in early Christian texts as a nickname for Jesus' brother; Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus; Mattia, Matthew; and one reading Maria Mene Mara, a name some scholars have connected to Mary Magdalene through a Gnostic text. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Not because of what the tomb proves, but because of what it cannot prove. The Israeli Antiquities Authority and mainstream archaeology have consistently maintained that all of these names were extremely common in first-century Judea, that the combination, while striking, falls within the range of statistical coincidence for a family tomb of this period. The controversy has never been fully resolved. The ossuaries sit in Israeli state storage. What's left is a family tomb, sealed since approximately the 1st century CE, opened accidentally by a construction drill, containing a cluster of names that either represent the most significant archaeological discovery in the history of Christianity, or the most unsettling coincidence in the history of archaeology. And nobody has been able to definitively determine which. Number 4. In 1897, workers cutting peat in the Dutch province of Drenthe, near the village of Ede, struck something unexpected beneath the surface of an ancient bog. When the foreman arrived and the peat was cleared, they found a body. A human being, small-framed, with reddish hair still partially intact, lying curled in the position of a fetal sleep, preserved by the chemistry of the bog since approximately 54 BCE. Here's the scale of what forensic analysis revealed. The Ede girl was approximately 16 years old at death. She had a slight spinal curvature, scoliosis, visible in life. Around her neck, still in place when found, was a band of cloth twisted into a ligature. She had been strangled. Physical evidence suggested the strangulation occurred before or during submersion, meaning she had not simply been disposed of after death. She had been killed there, or killed and immediately deposited. But here's where the story becomes genuinely haunting in its specificity. The Yid girl's hair, red at the left side of her skull and dark at the right, had been partially shaved from the left side before deposition. This deliberate alteration, the removal of half the hair from a victim before placing her in a bog, appears in other bog body cases and is believed by some researchers to represent a ritual marking, an identification of the victim as belonging to a specific category. Whether she was a criminal, a sacrifice, a social outcast, or something else entirely in the understanding of her community, she was placed in that bog with intention. Her death was managed. What's left is a face, reconstructed by forensic artists from her preserved skull, looking out from display cases in the Drents Museum in the Netherlands. A teenager, killed in 54 BCE, with half her hair shaved, strangled and drowned in a bog, whose face we can now see clearly enough to feel, uncomfortably, that we almost know her. Number 3. Beginning in the late 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, archaeologists working in the Tarim Basin in the Xinjiang region of what is now Western China began documenting a series of mummies so anomalous that they generated immediate and sustained international controversy. Here's the scale of what made them anomalous. The Tarim mummies, some dated to as early as 1800 BCE, were extraordinarily well preserved by the extreme aridity of the basin. Their physical characteristics were entirely inconsistent with East Asian populations. Tall stature, light-colored hair ranging from auburn to blonde, high-bridged noses, deep-set eyes, and facial structures researchers compared to populations from Western Eurasia. DNA analysis, published in a landmark 2021 study by a team led by Chunwan Zhang at Seoul National University, confirmed what physical examination had suggested. These individuals were genetically distinct from any surrounding Asian population, with ancestry tracing to an isolated population originating in Western Eurasia thousands of years before any documented contact between East and West. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing, and not just archaeologically. These people, with their Western faces, their plaid woolen textiles, their European-derived language reconstructed from related descendant tongues, were living in the heart of Central Asia, roughly 2,000 years before the Silk Road supposedly opened the first connections between China and the West. They were there first, and they left no surviving written record of who they were. What's left is a woman known as the Beauty of Lulan, found in 1980 near the ancient site of Lulan. Her face so well preserved that she looks as though she might open her eyes. A woman with auburn hair and distinctly non-Asian features, dead in the desert of Western China for nearly 4,000 years, whose people arrived there by a route and at a time that neither Chinese nor Western historical records acknowledge. Number 2. In 1996, archaeologists excavating at Goyet Cave in Belgium, a site that had been known to contain prehistoric remains since the 19th century, subjected a collection of Neanderthal bone fragments to systematic reanalysis. The results, published by researcher Hélène Rougier and her team in the journal Scientific Reports in 2016, describe something that permanently altered the comfortable narrative of Neanderthal life. The bones, belonging to at least 6 individuals, including adults and young children, showed unambiguous evidence of processing, identical to the processing of large game animals. Cut marks from stone tools consistent with defleshing, percussion fractures for marrow extraction, polish on bone surfaces consistent with use as tools after the flesh had been removed. The Neanderthals of Goyet Cave, at least 40,000 years ago, had systematically butchered and consumed members of their own group. Here's the scale of what that evidence implies. The bones, belonging to at least 6 individuals, including adults and young children, showed unambiguous evidence of processing identical to the processing of large game animals. Cut marks from stone tools consistent with defleshing. Percussion fractures for marrow extraction. Polish on bone surfaces consistent with use as tools after the flesh had been removed. The Neanderthals of Goyet Cave, at least 40,000 years ago, had systematically butchered and consumed members of their own group. But here's where the story becomes genuinely difficult to process. Goyet is not unique. Similar evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism has been documented at El Cedrón Cave in Spain, at Krapina in Croatia, and at several sites in France. What remains genuinely unknown, and may remain unknown, is whether this behavior was nutritional, ritualistic, a response to starvation, or something with no equivalent in modern human categories at all. The people doing it were not monsters by the measure of their world. They were our closest relatives, acting in ways we cannot fully explain, in a world that no longer exists. What's left is a collection of cut-marked bones in a Belgian museum, the processed remains of Neanderthal children and adults, sitting in labeled storage boxes. the physical evidence of an act we cannot explain and cannot dismiss. Because it happened, because we found the marks, and because the tools that were made from the bones of the dead may have been used to make more tools, right up until the moment the people who made them disappeared entirely. Number 1. On August 24th, 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Within 18 hours, the Roman city of Pompeii was buried under approximately 4 to 6 meters of volcanic ash and pumice. It was rediscovered in 1748. Systematic excavation under Giuseppe Fiorelli in the 1860s allowed archaeologists to fill cavities left in hardened ash by decomposed organic material with plaster, producing casts of the people they had once contained. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, California, sit approximately 12,000 kilometers from Pompeii and roughly 40,000 years further back in time. Since systematic excavation began in 1913, they have produced the remains of an estimated 3.5 million individual animals, 231 species of birds, and 59 species of mammals, all of which became trapped in naturally occurring asphalt seeps and died, unable to escape. Here's the scale of what both sites share, and why placing them together reveals something genuinely unsettling about the nature of traps. Research published in 2023 by behavioral ecologist Marcus Erickson confirmed what had long been theorized. The La Brea tar pits functioned as an acoustic trap. Animals dying in the asphalt produced distress sounds. Those sounds attracted predators. The predators became trapped in turn. The remains of an extraordinary number of apex predators, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American lions, vastly outnumber prey species because the trap was most effective at killing the animals that came to kill. Every entry on this list describes the same fundamental thing: a moment when human beings, or the beings that preceded us, came into contact with death on terms they didn't choose, couldn't escape, and left evidence of, preserved in stone, bone, ash, or bog, that we are still reading thousands of years later. The ash preserved the Pompeians. The bog preserved the Ida girl. The asphalt preserved the predators that walked into the sound of dying. The desert preserved the faces of people whose names we don't know. Preservation is not mercy. It is simply the continuation of the moment of death, extended indefinitely, in whatever medium happened to be available. Every artifact on this list is a person, or a mind, or a child, or a culture, frozen in a specific instant and handed, intact, to a future that never expected to receive them. We are that future. And the only honest response to what we've found is the recognition that what preserved these remains was indifferent to the suffering that created them. The ash didn't care. The bog didn't care. The asphalt didn't care. They simply kept what they were given, and they are still keeping it, in museums and storage facilities and excavation sites across the world, waiting for the next person to open the next drawer and find the next thing that should not have survived this long. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.